The first ever Getting to Zero Town Hall session. I say first ever, but we actually had one this morning for people who needed a different time zone. So this is one of two of these sessions we're having today. It's good to see some familiar names and faces. And for those of you who I don't know, my name is Jesse Fonstock. I'm the Director of Decarbonization at the Global Maritime Forum. And really appreciate you joining us today. I wanted to start with a quick explanation of what this meeting is and how it might be a little bit different from some of the things we typically do in the Getting to Zero Coalition. A lot of you will be familiar with our workshops and our working sessions and maybe our webinars. This is going to be a little different. This is a little bit more of an informational session. It's a chance to share what we think are some important updates with the breadth of the coalition membership, we hope. We did have quite a large group this morning, so we'll probably be less than half of the coalition today or this afternoon. Sorry, afternoon our time for those of you. But we are very pleased to be able to reach out with these updates to a big part of the membership. It's going to be a little bit less interactive than normal for Getting to Zero. We don't usually like to do a lot of presenting, but there's going to be a bit more presenting today than usual. That said, there will be a chance to ask questions at the end and maybe even engage in some discussion. I think we've left ourselves with more than enough time. Don't anticipate this taking 90 minutes, but if we get into a really good discussion, we'll make use of this time. But we will save the questions until the end. So just roughly, the broad agenda is a little bit structured around past, present, and future. We're going to take a look back at the Getting to Zero Coalition's impact so far, and that's a complex thing to cover because we think we've had quite a significant impact and a far-reaching one. But we'll provide some perspective on the impact that we've all had together so far, and that's to set the stage for a discussion of the currently adopted Getting Zero Coalition strategy, which covers the next 5 years. And we'll have a short presentation of that. And then we're going to introduce something new, and that will be the longest bit of the presentation time. This is something called the Action Framework, which I'll get into in depth later. And we anticipate that this will be a good opportunity to ask questions. It's going to be a new concept for the coalition and for its members, and we welcome questions and feedback and clarifications on that, especially today. Again, at the end of the time. Before we get started, some typical housekeeping. So we like it if everybody who participates can see who else is participating. So we encourage you to add your name and your organization's name. If you've never done that before, look at your thumbnail picture, find the 3 dots at the upper right, and click on them, and you'll be able to rename. Do add your organization's name, please, so others can see where you've joined from. Beyond that, please do keep yourself on mute unless you're speaking in the Q&A. Very happy to see you. I don't hear any background noise now, so it seems like you're all very used to that. That's great. In terms of asking questions, you can put them in the chat at any time. So if you think it serves as a good reminder, you can put them in the chat when it comes up, and we'll address them when we get to the Q&A period. If you have a spontaneous question during the Q&A period, you can also just raise your hand using the hand raise function in Zoom, which I'm sure you're all. So something that we don't always do in our meetings anymore is explain what the Getting to Zero Coalition is. We have a lot of interaction with a lot of you, and but we think we're reaching a slightly broader audience, and we anticipate that there are even some new coalition members in the group today. So we want to just reintroduce the coalition for clarity's sake. We are a coalition of more than 200 organizations, including more than 160 companies. But also we have representatives from other types of organizations: international, intergovernmental, governmental, civil society, academia, think tanks, and the like. But the core of the membership is made up of companies from the maritime value chain, and particularly the hoped-for future maritime value chain. What binds us together is this ambition statement that you see here. I hope that you're all familiar with it, but the purpose of the coalition is to pursue this ambition of getting commercially viable zero-emission ships and using zero-emission fuels on the water by 2030 as a part of a journey to full decarbonization by 2050. We launched the coalition in 2019. And since then, we have done a number of things. Broadly speaking, one of the things we've done is to try to build up the member base so that we have a broad and deep member base working for this high level of ambition. We've also tried to develop the knowledge base around decarbonization and the things that are needed to achieve these ambitions. And to also look at concrete action, both from industry and from governments, and to build groups within the coalition that can pursue specific pieces of action, which we'll get into a bit more later. These efforts may be in policy or in more commercially oriented arenas, and they might create impact in maritime and beyond, but they're decarbonization centric. For what it's for the sake of posterity, it's worth mentioning that the Getting Zero Coalition was originally founded by GMF together with the World Economic Forum and the Friends of Ocean Action. The World Economic Forum and Friends of Ocean Action are still with us as founding members, but the coalition is now managed by GMF solely. So that's how it's run today. With that as a background, I wanted to introduce a couple of my colleagues who will talk a little bit about what we've achieved. And again, I think it's important to stress that we've achieved a lot, and this is just a summary and even a partial picture. And to talk about what we've achieved in the area of policy action, I'd like to introduce Sophie Dion, who's the team lead for policy and government engagement at the Global Maritime Forum. Sophie, over to you.
Thanks, Jesse, and hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to meet many of you for the first time online and some other more known faces from my previous experience in the Sea Cargo Charter before joining the policy team. So I'm going to make a quick point on policy action, as Jesse mentioned, looking backwards at what has been done and achieved, with keeping in mind that the main objective was to use the coalition to engage, inform, and support with the IMO at the international level, but also with regional and national policy makers to influence actions. And the main activities that have been performed in that context were to inform industry champions through webinars, develop messages and narratives through analysis and intensified briefs, and of course dispatch them within and beyond the industry and to policymakers, but also disseminating messages and narratives through op-eds, public-private dialogues that have taken place, and also direct engagement with policymakers, either bilaterally or multilaterally. And the impacts that we've seen of this work over the past years has taken different shapes, one of which is the 250 signatories or slightly more that have actually signed the call of action for shipping decarbonization, but also the direct results of the work and ambition of the coalition fitting into the IMO strategy from last summer, the latest one, with this goal to reach at least 5% of scalable zero emission fuels uptake by 2030, and including also the just and equitable transition dimension. But there has also been progress at the European level, matching the ambition of the coalition, and that reflects, of course, the narratives that have been co-created within that group over the years and communicated broadly. And finally, we want to stress that we also have seen an increasing understanding of the shipping's role in national energy policies, so making this link between shipping and energy, including via the support for green corridors, offtake agreements, hydrogen strategies, and infrastructure building. And that fits well into the next actions that Marika will cover.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm the Deputy Director for Decarbonization here in the GMF team, and I can see many familiar faces, so great to have you all here. On the industry action side, we are primarily using the Getting to Zero Coalition to turn industry engagements into concrete action, which includes a number of deep sea green shipping corridors, where many of you are working with us directly as well. The activities that we cover in that area include the production of knowledge pieces and blueprints, whether that's the transition strategy or actual feasibility analysis and reports describing how green corridors will work in future, or could work in future, I should say. We are convening thought-leading task forces that are supporting and informing these green corridor consortia, or informing us how we might be looking at booking claim systems. And then, of course, we make sure that we share all of these actions and the progress that we're making around this industry action to policymakers and others. In form of impact, we are seeing many green corridors being launched and are taking off at quite good speed, as from what we can say, and they're now being looked at as a sort of instrumental way to achieve early take-up of zero-emission fuels. They can help trigger early investments and create learnings for the larger transition. We are establishing these kinds of initiatives on crucial trade routes, including container shipping on the Singapore-Rotterdam corridor, or, for example, the dry bulk Australia to East Asia iron ore corridor. As part of these programs, we are identifying key opportunities, risks, and barriers to early action. And it's also really exciting to see that multiple governments are now developing support measures to make these corridors a reality. Back to you, Jesse.
Thanks, Marika. Maybe people noticed that the presentation on policy ended with a comment about industry, and the presentation on industry ended with a comment about policy. And I think that that reflects that we don't pursue these things separately, right? The Getting to Zero Coalition sees industry action and policy action as mutually reinforcing. It's the core of our strategy, really. The underlying hypothesis is that we can promote better policy action through industry initiative and vice versa. And I want to ask Femke to introduce to you the strategy in a little bit more detail, although only at a fairly superficial level. I hope that you've already seen the Getting to Zero Coalition strategy. If you haven't, please do get in touch with us. We're happy to share. But Femke will take you through some of the core elements of it now. You're still muted, Femke.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so as Jesse mentioned, we had a coalition strategy that ran until the end of 2023. So we started the process last year of reflecting a bit over the changes that happened in political landscape and industry landscape that both Sophie and Marika already touched upon. And together with our coalition strategy group, which is a group of about 13 industry members and knowledge partners from the Getting to Zero Coalition, we developed a new Getting to Zero Coalition strategy for 2024 to 2028. So as was already mentioned before, the IMO is currently in the process of developing the midterm policy measures that are supposed to deliver on the targets that are set out in the revised greenhouse gas strategy that was adopted last year. So they're currently being developed, and the aim is to adopt them in 2025 with the earliest possible entry into force in 2027. And then the greenhouse gas strategy itself is again up for revision in 2028. So we've set our new strategy also around these timelines that are set by the IMO. So the coalition strategy started in 2024 until 2028, but with a checkpoint in 2026 after the adoption of the midterm measures. So based on these discussions, we've identified two really key objectives for our work. The first one being to foster progress around first mover projects, as what we refer to as going deep, where the focus here is really on those first movers, and to through those first movers and first mover activity to explore challenges and to identify and test and demonstrate solutions, but also generate learnings from those initial solutions that are then kind of fundamental for the wider transition across the value chain and across geographies. So that means in practice a continued focus on the role of green corridors, but also generating the learnings from those green corridors and making sure that we eventually link up those green corridors to a more kind of broader reach. And then the second objective here is to prepare the transition at scale, which we refer to as going broad. So here the focus is really on ensuring that the transition is really fully global, which requires action not only by the first movers, but by every single stakeholder of the maritime value chain, from across all the geographies and also from small to large companies. So again, in practice, the emphasis here is really on supporting the development of policy measures at the IMO to ensure that transition is not only full, but it's also something we refer to as just and equitable. And we do this through engagements with policymakers on an international level, but also on a regional level, as well as on a national level, where we focus on more kind of national policy frameworks for international shipping decarbonization. So, for example, working with developing countries to explore and unlock their potential for global for zero emission fuel production. So that leads us to what Jesse was already referring to, our theory of change. So how we actually kind of approach these objectives and how we make sure that we work towards these objectives. And this is really where the policy and the industry piece come together. So we have three pillars that kind of form what we call our ambition loop. So starting with the policy environments, the rights environment on all these different levels that I've mentioned are really, really important to enable the full transition. And this includes then international, national, and regional levels to close the fuel gap in terms of both cost and availability, but also make sure that the transition is just and equitable. And then the second pillar is the industry action around showcasing industry leadership that includes technological developments, commitments to zero emission vessels, zero emission fuel production, zero emission infrastructure, green corridors. All of those activities across the maritime value chain really inform and inspire policymakers to make those decisions, and it provides them with the confidence to actually put those policy frameworks in place and that the transition is feasible. So in this policy, in the right policy for environment, the industry is also able to scale up their action across the value chain, across geographies. And then this is all kind of bound together by the third pillar, which is facilitation, dialogue, and showcasing. So really focusing on unlocking those positive industry and policy actions through facilitation of leadership, of all of your leadership as members of the Getting to Zero Coalition, and making sure that there's dialogue between these different levels, between policymakers and industry, but also within industry and different segments to showcase this tangible action and to make sure that we all have confidence in the transition, but we also understand what we need to make this happen.
Thank you, Femke. I think that that was a terrific overview of the strategy. It's very difficult to get down to the concrete when reviewing the strategy, but I think most of you will be aware that this strategy is an overlay on a lot of very specific things we do together as a coalition. So we manage a number of working groups and task forces that your organizations participate in. We publish a lot of papers. We participate and convene a lot of meetings. That's not all captured there, but it is all. The idea is to have the strategy be the guiding framework for that. But really, the impact of the coalition is, of course, much bigger than that. The impact of the coalition is based on what all of your organizations are actually doing on decarbonization. And until now, we haven't really had a way of capturing those actions. And so we wanted to dive into a new idea that we've had called the Getting to Zero Action Framework. And what do we mean by action framework? It's not necessarily a standardized concept or phrase. So we want to make it clear what we mean by it. We want to be able to evaluate the actions taken by this coalition and how they contribute to achieving our ambitions. And so we're developing a framework that will help us do that. The one advantage that we have is that as a coalition, we have, for the past 2 years, co-authored a report alongside Race to Zero and UMass on the sector's progress overall towards achieving the 2030 goal of 5% zero emission fuels. So that report actually provides a framework which we then think we can apply to the coalition itself and see how much the coalition is doing to contribute to these goals. And we think that will help us evaluate ourselves and be very valuable for self-reflection, but also provide some inspiration on the way forward. And we'll get a little bit more into that on the next slide. So why did we end up taking this idea on board? Well, in our process of strategy development, we heard from a couple of things from multiple member organizations. We heard that there was a desire to get broader engagement from the membership. So We have a lot of members who are very active in our working groups and task forces, etc. But we're very aware that not everybody is able to participate in those, and that those activities will be unlikely to reach the full coalition. So we wanted something that captured more what the breadth of the coalition was doing. We also heard from multiple members of the coalition that it was important that we be confident ourselves that we really are an industry-leading coalition, that we really are at the forefront of decarbonization in the maritime sector. And we don't actually have a fact base for that yet. So the action framework is really about that as well. And finally, there was an idea that it might help us learn from each other by identifying actions that we're taking. It might inspire other actions from other companies. It might also identify some gaps and inspire people to do things that aren't being done today. So in order to develop something that would address these 3 points, we worked first with the Getting to Zero Coalition Strategy Group on solidifying the idea. Then we worked with the drafting group, where we actually reached outside the coalition to a number of organizations that have worked with similar ideas in other sectors, and got their input on how to think about this. And then we developed an industry reference group where we have members of the coalition providing more detailed input on the specific framework as it develops. So we have 3 groups that have supported us on this. The industry reference group being I know some of you are here today, so it's good to see you, and we really thank you for your input so far. We can go to the next slide. So the overall objectives are to increase the transparency of the actions that we take as a community. This is to support, again, the idea that we are a coalition of leaders on decarbonization, and also to promote collective accountability on that. Now, this isn't about accountability of individual organizations. That's not the goal here. It's about holding the coalition as a whole accountable to delivering on its own ambition. The second objective, which I referred to earlier, is to provide some inspiration on actions companies can take with the coalition, and potentially outside the coalition, of course, as well. And finally, something we haven't mentioned yet, or Femke referred to, but in the context of the action framework, we do think that this could be an important input into potential revision of the coalition strategy, so that when we get to 2026 and we want to look at where we stand and how well placed we are, having a fact base about how we're living up to our own ambitions will really help us revise the strategy for the second half of this period. So with that, I want to actually ask Frank Dubielczyk from Hapag-Lloyd to hop in here. Frank has been kind enough to join the industry reference group that I referred to, and talk a little bit about his perspective on why this could be meaningful, and how he sees it from as a representative of Hapag and also as a member of the coalition. So Frank, over to you for a few words.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. Maybe before I start, I saw that Carleen had raised her hand. Not sure whether you still want to comment before I go on, or shall I just? Oh.
No, just continue. I was referencing the previous, the end of the previous presentation that had what looked like a Venn diagram with a hole in the middle. And I always like to rewrite slides, so I was suggesting that we could fill that hole with the work that's being done by this group.
All right.
Thank you, Carleen. If you'd like to, we can revisit that at the end as well. So yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So then I go on. So my name is Frank Dubielczyk, joined Hapag-Lloyd 3 years ago, working in the sustainability team. And Hapag-Lloyd became a member of Getting to Zero Coalition in 2020. And since then, we have been engaged in activities like a book and claim task force, and joined the coalition-wide workshops. And as said recently, we have been part of the industry reference group for this framework, and the different sectors of the maritime value chain have been represented in this group. So as Jesse introduced, the key objective of this framework is to increase the transparency of our community, and also inspire the member companies what action they could undertake. And this is why is that important? So firstly, what we as individual members do within and outside of the coalition can help supporting, of course, conversations with the policymakers and inspire each industry member. When we showcase that we already making concrete progress and that we invest in the transition, this then obviously sends a strong signal to the policymakers that the transition is possible, that we are working on it, but that ambitious policy frameworks are in addition required to continue on this pathway, or even to maybe to speed it up. And secondly, it is of course also important that we make sure that the coalition stays relevant as a coalition of leaders. So you might have, or I'm sure you have noticed that the landscape in which we as companies and as a coalition operate, that this has significantly changed over the last year. So you have a new revised EMO strategy from 2023, but there's also a broader landscape of initiatives that focus on shipping and decarbonization. And therefore, it is important that we move on from commitments and the call to actions, which I think they were very valuable at that point in time, but that we also, we have concrete action, but that we also go on with that, with the actions, with the investments, and also communicate about these as a community. And if we do so, then we have a strong basis for really claiming to be a coalition of leaders, and this then can help strengthen the relevance of the coalition, and maybe it also makes it easier to open a couple of doors. Okay, so looking at the benefits that this framework can have for us, so there are multiple benefits. One benefit is even not listed, so you'll have the chance to fill in an additional questionnaire. So actually, this was my first thought when joining the reference group, not another one, but same with other questionnaires, be it CDP, be it now preparation for CSRD, whatever, which somehow us all would frame as questionnaires. If you work on these, it has benefits for you. And for some of you, there might only one be applicable. For others, it might be two or all of them. So firstly, related to the previous slide, it's a great way for us as members to be an active part of this coalition. So just not signing, but also being active and doing something, so to say, and collectively leverage individual action. And we all have become members of the Getting to Zero Coalition to contribute to shipping's decarbonization, both individually and collectively. And this initiative provides an opportunity for us as members to contribute to the strength of the coalition. And then secondly, as the framework then would consist of a menu of actions, yeah. So your actions that you communicate on, and of the other members, it can help your or all members' green transition, because you have ideas what next steps could be. So if you look at Hapag-Lloyd as a carrier and as an owner, we obviously already have quite some knowledge on what to do also next with regards to decarbonization, but we might also get some additional ideas for investments into zero emission vessels, green corridors, training that is needed for the green transition and other aspects. And as the actions from the members are collated, the framework can then also help us to get a better understanding how far similar companies have come. And this thirdly then gives us, or you also, the opportunity to so somewhat anonymously benchmark your progress against similar companies. And yet, yes, we will dive deeper into it. So the individual reporting of companies will be aggregated on a collective level. And you, of course, know your individual reporting, which will not be automatically be shared with the wider coalition. But you can, of course, compare then your own actions with the actions of your segment. And fourthly, related to that, you will understand also the industry best practices. In the best case, you showing the best practice already, but if not, then you can see what the others are doing. And understanding then what actions are required to achieve coalitions' shared ambitions. This also helps you to identify the right actions to undertake. And finally, as a coalition also has knowledge partners, there's also a benefit for them and then for you and us, because when you identify gaps or aspects which hinder your progress, they can help supporting or can support filling these gaps through additional research or other actions. With that, I'm handing the mic back to Jesse.
Thank you, Frank. And I enjoyed your comment that filling out a questionnaire is it sounds a little bit like taking your medicine. I don't know how I feel about being the one who's prescribing the medicine here, but I think you're right. I think it's an insightful point that actually, when we make the time to do these things, we do learn. So thank you for sharing that perspective. So what will the action framework actually look like? We're not at the point where we can share a draft framework with everyone yet, so we're going to be sharing some generalities. There will be essentially a menu of actions we'll be asking for respondents to comment on. And your responses on that menu of actions will be to choose the actions that are relevant to your company, describe the action in that category that you're taking, and then there will be a section where we basically put those actions into tiers that represent how far have we come. And so that will be part of the evaluation of the responses. Essentially, the first two, the action choice and the description, is the job of the company, and the assigning of tiers will be the job of the Global Maritime Forum. And I'll get into that when I describe the process a bit. So in terms of what will be expected of you, there will be a 2-month period for reporting where we will distribute this questionnaire that Frank referred to, and we will ask you to respond. We'll have some time for you to ask questions and get clarity on things. We do not think that the response should be burdensome. While we haven't finalized the framework yet, at the moment, I think we have a menu of 32 actions, and because those cover the entire value chain from the demand side, the supply side, finance, and even policy, only a limited number of those actions will be relevant for any one organization. So we think that an organization that has a lot of relevant activities might need to fill out 10, say, a third of the list. So we don't think this should be a particularly burdensome process, and we really want you to focus on the things you are sure you can respond on and skipping the ones that you can't. After this reporting period, we'll have a sort of analysis and writing period, and that will sit with the Global Maritime Forum team, where we process the responses into a summary report. And a little bit more on that in the next slide. So again, we'll have a period where you submit a form, and then GMF will grade those submissions. So grading sounds a little bit scary from my perspective, and maybe from yours as well. But basically, sorting these actions into tiers that indicate how far they've come in terms of progress towards the coalition's goals. And so we will then summarize that for each organization, and provide the results back to you, as Frank noted. The information will all be treated confidentially the whole time, so we will not be sharing your responses with anybody else. And when we share it back with you, we will also share the current state of the overall coalition responses at that point, so you'll be able to compare where your your submissions stand compared to the broader coalition. And then finally, we will produce a report that will be publicly available, but that report will only talk about the grade for the coalition as a whole. So no individual results will be published in that report. So I just shared this, but I think it's very important. We will treat all this information confidentially, and there may be an opportunity for companies to opt in to having their responses shared. If they fill out their responses, they don't think there's any sensitive material, and they be willing or even eager to have their responses shared with others in the coalition or beyond, then you'll be able to opt in and say that. But without that consent, we will not be sharing your responses with anyone else. The compiled action report, again, is about the coalition's progress and not about any one company's progress, but it will allow individual companies who know how much progress they've made to benchmark themselves against the coalition as a whole. And as we work to communicate the overall findings, the compiled findings, we will make reference to the sector-wide report that I referred to earlier and compare how the coalition is doing compared to how we see the whole sector progressing. And maybe the most interesting outcome of this will be, how we can use it internally as a coalition to shape our actions going forward. If we find that there are gaps, that there aren't many getting zero companies working on one specific aspect of the transition, that can be quite informative, and we might want to work on it. Or if we find that there are opportunities to connect actions being taken in different parts of the value chain, that also could be quite interesting. So we will use them internally in our own workshops. Again, not providing any information about specific companies' activities without consent from those companies. So that was the end of the, for us, quite lengthy presentation part of this conversation. And now I want to throw the floor open to questions. It can be questions about the action framework, and it's our assumption that there may be some questions about that. But we're also welcome questions about the strategy. And that was the question that Carleen had when she raised her hand before. Maybe that's what you want to go back to, or you might have something else now, Carleen. You're welcome to take the floor.
Thank you very much. And I'm very excited that this coalition is operating in this fashion as a true coalition and sharing best practices and being willing to share where they are. I wanted to know, however, in the final report, how you're going to accommodate some anomalies that are happening in the global framework today. Some of those anomalies that I would point to, for instance, are things like the geopolitical landscape right now. Nobody could have anticipated the Red Sea crisis. Nobody could have anticipated the increase of shipping emissions because ships were forced to go around Africa. So I think it's going to be important when you're messaging the results to also contextualize it within the framework of these anomalies, such as what's going on in the Red Sea, because there are groups out there that are gunning for, that have the shipping industry in the crosshairs, and they're gunning for the industry and trying to say the industry isn't doing what it's even promised to do. In other words, I wouldn't want to see a report that pointed to the Getting to Zero Coalition saying, well, gee, our ambition was X, but our coalition has only achieved Y, without contextualizing it within the framework of, IMO's benchmarks haven't been set. And again, the geopolitical, not to mention, you can tell by my accent, not to mention what's coming up in the US political arena with the US elections. That's holding some companies back in terms of making commitments on the environmental side, because we don't know what's going to happen in November. So those are just some concerns. I'm delighted that we're working as a coalition and being willing to share our own company's benchmarks, but I'm concerned about how that information is presented on the other end.
Thank you, Carleen. And as someone who shares your accent, let me say that it makes me nervous, you just mentioning November. So I've been trying to pretend that I don't have to think about that yet. But I just to address some of your points, which I think are really good ones. So first, I know you were only using the the Red Sea example as an example, right? But I do want to be clear to all the participants that while the framework is not complete yet, one thing that will not be in there is quantitative emissions data. Like that is not something we are going to ask about. That is something that is handled in other fora. We have a number of our own initiatives, the Seco Car Charter, for example, that do that, and there are other groups like the Clean Cargo Working Group that do it for container shipping, and many companies do it in their own reporting. So that is not something we are going to try to repeat here. However, your broader point is quite a good one, that action is dependent on context. And we very much take on board the need for context in the actual publication of the report. One thing that I would encourage you, I'm sure you have lots of free time to read all the reports that are published in the world. The Climate Action and Shipping report that I referred to earlier, which looks at the progress of the sector as a whole, does exactly that, right? So it looks at all these levers in the context of what's happening in the world, right? And so while it presents, okay, this area is behind, when it presents an area that, okay, we're not getting enough final investment decisions on fuel production, for example, you might provide the context of the IMO policy situation, that there's a lot of waiting for the midterm measures to be. So that report is a good example of how we would handle those kinds of considerations, and we definitely will be providing context. It won't be a report that says nothing. However, we do want it to be an honest report, and if we are honestly not living up to our ambitions, it should serve the function of communicating that as well, and with context, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the group? Either things were much clearer this time around, or it's later in the day and there's less energy here. Michael, please jump in. Good to see you, Michael. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, hi there. Nice to see you too, Jesse, and plenty of familiar names and faces. Happy to jump in. Obviously, I'm from well, maybe not obviously, given my accent. Speaking of accents, but I'm with the United Kingdom in IMO greenhouse gas delegations. Also work quite a bit with Global Maritime Forum and Getting to Zero Coalition. Through our contribution to the zero emission shipping mission, through Clydebank Declaration, green shipping corridors, all that good stuff. It's not so much a question, I guess, at this point, and I promise Jesse and Marika and everyone else didn't put me up to it. But I think this is an excellent idea and an excellent initiative. For those of you who are unfortunate enough to follow the UK's political situation, you'll know you won't hear much from me in terms of what we're thinking or doing and so on and so forth, at least for the next little bit. But something we're often asked about is, well, exactly what is industry up to? Can they do more? Are they doing enough? You know, why should we as the government have to step in and do this or do that? We all know that the IMO regulations, which have been brought up and which we're looking to agree this coming spring, will be a big piece of that. So to be able to point to a place where we can show how many companies are doing how much excellent work and doing sort of the utmost, and this is where sort of they stop and where we, the regulators, have to begin. I think will be quite valuable. I looked at the timeline that you proposed, and with my little sort of Gantt chart of the calendar ahead, I quite smiled because, wouldn't you know it, the end of January, 31st of January, is MEPC 83, the big IMO committee's paper deadline. So I don't know if you have any sort of visions or aspirations of perhaps being able to circulate part of this as part of an information paper, but I'm sure myself as a member state, other member states would be also benefit to know about all that work that's happening, and not least in a context where that April for that meeting at MEPC 83, we know that there's going to be it's going to be one of the big ones. It'll be like July last year, if not more so, because we're actually agreeing on how we're going to do things, how we're going to regulate. It's not just a piece of paper anymore. So I think the more positive stories there are to tell, the more pressure, for lack of a better term, that can be put on the international regulators of the world. I think the better. I would welcome it personally. I can only speak sort of personally at this point. But I just wanted to say I think it's an excellent initiative. I'm looking forward to seeing what's going to come out of it. And I would urge yourselves to think about how it can sort of the vehicle for it afterwards when we look at sort of the timings that are to come in the following spring, because there's a lot of opportunities there for this to be really impactful. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That's very encouraging to hear. We will keep the caveat in mind that you're speaking as an individual and not as a country. But I just want to reflect on the idea that you threw in at the end, which is both appealing and a little daunting to have this in a state that we might be able to have an information paper derived from it. I think we should provisionally accept that challenge and see what we can do. I have to be honest, because we've never done this before. We are planning for some bumps in the road, and we'll see how easily we get over them. Right? But it's pretty much in the coalition's DNA to take some chances. So if we're able to do it in a way that's useful to the process, I'm sure we would all welcome that. So thank you for the idea.
No, my pleasure. And just to say, I've seen all the lovely and unbelievable timelines you've managed to hit on everything from Green Corridors reports that you've put together and that we've had to feed into and sort of take our medicine on. So if anyone can do it, it's definitely yourselves. But worst comes to worst, a lunch and learn, right?
You're being
anyway,
very flattering. You're flattering, but you're also putting pressure on us, Michael. I know what you're up to here. Anyway, thank you so much for the idea and for the encouragement, and it means a lot to have that hypothesis that this could be useful to governments confirmed. So thank you very much. I do see the comment in the chat is actually about the strategy, and it's actually a very interesting one. So I'm going to take a minute to just, actually raise your hand now. Please share your comments.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Yes, the comments on the chat was mine. Michele Francioni from MSC Cruises. I know my point, of course, thank you very much for the comprehensive review of the strategy and the action plan. Absolutely happy to support this one. My comment is a bit relevant to the fact that, of course, here we are talking about wide shipping industry, let's say wide shipping industry with different, let's say, different operational routes and operational and type of ships. So it will be important to identify, in my opinion, which are the more common issues to make sure that we focus on the real priorities and avoid, of course, very detailed or sectorial issues. And also this would avoid, let's say, to overlap with the other institution or association actions, which probably are a bit more, let's say, focus on specific industry sectors. Just that's my comment on that, but happy to support that one. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's very, very helpful comment. So we really appreciate that. And thank you for expressing your support for the action. I see, Adrian, you put something in the chat that I'd welcome you to express it verbally if you're able to chime in. If not, I can take it for you.
Hey, Jesse, just the question about if we were to complete these activities, under what instrument would that information sharing be undertaken? Would a separate NDA or agreement cover that, or is this under the overall GMF terms and conditions? And the only reason why I table that is going through various internal activities to ensure that we can share information, even though it may be restricted, but it's that reporting timeline and those cycles, particularly with sensitive data.
It's a very interesting question, actually, and why I want to voice it. And it's not one we have a clear answer to yet. We're in the design phase, and in our discussions in the design phase, we've been leaning toward not wanting to have any information that might need to be recovered or covered by an NDA included, so that we probably need to have a few test cases to see what sensitivities there are on these questions. I would actually invite you, if you're willing to be one of maybe our pilot respondents, we would be happy to send you the examples early, so you can give an indication of whether you think that something like that might be needed. But the default assumption is that we will basically not have a standard NDA for these, but it's something we're possibly going to need to revisit as we get feedback from the companies. Femke, I don't know if you had any other thoughts or any discussions with other members on that.
Nothing specific. I think for the we don't know exactly what the form is going to look like, but what it will include is kind of, you know, agreeing to how we use these results, and that will be, of course, very specific information of how we use these results. But everyone will also have the option to opt in on using some of your actions as an example. But this is only with your explicit consent, and that's on a very kind of broad overall level. So, for example, if you're working on a green corridor, we can maybe refer to that green corridor in the aggregate report as an example, but we won't share any confidential information. And you're also always welcome to indicate what information that would cover and what it wouldn't cover. But again, this is around actions that have already taken place or that are already ongoing. So hopefully, as Jesse mentioned, it shouldn't cover anything that falls under NDA.
Well, I would actually really like to test that theory, though, Adrian, and everybody else, so that if there are companies who would be willing to take a look early on and indicate whether they thought that the terms that we included in the form, which will, you know, basically state the principles of confidentiality that Femke just mentioned, needed to be covered by a formal NDA, we would need to discover that quickly. So I'll follow up with you separately, Adrian. But if anybody else would also like to take a look, you can contact any of us, myself or Femke, afterwards, and we'll be happy to include you as an early, get your eyes on it early.
Yeah, and then maybe just even early mock-ups of some of those items, Jesse, that you may, or Femke, that you may want to sort of flush out, even a mock-up of the end results. And so we could think about what information may be required to achieve that outcome.
Yeah.
And this is like with the cargo owner's hat on here, the challenge is that the vessel owners would need to then, if there's any of that information that's coming through from the actual vessel owner to the cargo owner to the metrics, then we need to ensure that we have the authorization to, or at least the protection measures.
Yeah.
We're not necessarily the owner of the original data. So how that information flow, and this is with a cargo owner hat on, not necessarily on the marine fuels and the production and supply of those aspects, which is a different angle.
Yeah, we can definitely see some potential sensitivities in our initial conversations with the reference group that we've assembled. We haven't heard their reaction to the mock-ups that you're referring to has not included concerns about an NDA, but we need to test it further. So very happy to share that the material we have now with you separately. Hadis, I think you're next.
Thank you, Jesse. Hello, everyone. Great to see you, hear you all. Can you hear me well?
We can. We can't quite see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, that's interesting because I have my camera on.
Your camera's on, but it's not. It's at a strange angle. But
okay.
There you are.
Here now?
Yes, there we go. Nice to see you.
Okay, great. So two questions I have, Jesse. I want to go a step back when we talk about ambition and our vision. I know that we still talk about zero emission vessels and zero emission fuels, and I wonder whether the narrative here has changed given all the developments around the green fuels. Is it realistic to still speak about net zero fuels and zero emission vessels, especially given all the latest developments where, you know, for example, green ammonia, green methanol, they're being challenged as to what extent they are indeed zero emission fuels. So this is my first question, whether, you know, this is a thesis on which we want to insist, or whether you know, we're taking some flexibility, especially when, you know, even the IMO is talking about yes, zero emissions, but also around zero emissions. And my second question is around engagement with policymakers. I just want to raise a flag here that we need to be mindful of the various industry organizations, associations that exist in shipping, and make sure that we keep a balance as to how we are perceived, and whether these associations feel that in a way we're stepping on their feet, because part of their formal let's say job description is to engage with policymakers. So I think that this is an area that needs to be handled with care. Thank you.
Thank you, Carson. Just to take that second question first, yeah, I was just talking to Santi and Sophie about this yesterday, actually, and it's something that's constantly on the top of our mind, how we can develop our policy in a way, in a work that doesn't impinge on members' other positioning, where they have to act as part of a consensus building process in their industry association. So it's constantly something we're considering. So, for example, the work on midterm measures that we're undertaking right now definitely takes that into consideration, right? We have so far generated we published an insight brief and generated some overall positions that we think are compatible and allow people working within their various industry associations to take more specific positions. But it's a very good point. It's something we happy to be reminded about, but we definitely agree it's important. On the fuels case, I would say that we haven't changed anything formally about our fuel scope at this point. I felt the language in the revised strategy, 0 and near zero, was quite useful, actually. And I actually think if you look in the details of our fuels scoping note, that is what we need when we say zero emission fuels, and it's a little bit of a shorthand. So we're talking about fuels that can achieve very high GHG reductions in the long term, and so we're happy to continue thinking about the language. And it's not something, you're not the first person to raise it, right? I think that there is a risk that some people may feel uncomfortable or not have the same point of reference when one says zero emission fuels, but I do think it's actually quite nice that the new strategy, the language in the new strategy says 0 and near zero, because I think that's a useful framing, and we'll take that under consideration as we go forward. But nothing formally has changed, and this survey will come with a reference to the fuel scoping note, so people can know what we're talking about.
Great, thank you, Jess.
Thank you. There are a number of or at least 2 more questions in the chat. Maria, would you like to voice your question verbally, or would you like me to read it? It's fine with me either way.
I can do it verbally. Good morning, everybody, or hello, depending on where you are. Good to see you all. Thank you for a really, really interesting presentation, and also just it's so optimistic. That's we need that reassurance at this point. Now, I was just wondering, because you refer a lot to the famous 5% target of IMO by 2030, and this target, to my knowledge, has not really been defined in terms of, is it only RFNBOs? Is it the fuels that gives a certain GHG reduction, or what is it actually? And I don't think it's really being discussed at IMO. It's more of a political ambition, right? So it's going to be interesting to see if the midterm measures will actually also point to reaching the 5% target. But since you're using it as a reference, do you have a definition, and then how are you going to measure the progress? Thanks.
So one of the things I mentioned, thank you, Brianna, and then this is obviously related to what Kelly just said, and it's not a perfectly straightforward question, but to answer. But one of the nice things is that we do have this sector-wide report, which is called Climate Action in Shipping, which I referred to earlier, which looks at the industry's overall progress. And that report does focus on the RFNBOs is the term we use. That's the European term, I guess, and I think that's what that report focuses on. And the logic there is a little bit that because it's focused on 2030, it's focused on ensuring that the potentially scalable long-term solutions reach a certain point of maturity by 2030. It's all about that process of early action to ensure that those fuels have a chance to serve the market in the long term. So that is essentially the same framing we use for the action framework. But again, there will be material when we distribute the form. There'll be supporting material, like be an FAQ. How the IMO, and I mean, it's a very interesting question you asked about how the IMO ends up defining it. I don't follow, I'm sure many people here follow the negotiations more closely than I do. My impression is that the 2030 target per se, the fuel target, is not really being discussed very much, but that the discussion around potential revenue recycling might be the place where that actually comes into play. Where if there is revenue and it gets recycled, it would be to some subset of fuels, which would then need to be defined. And so I think that's going to be the telling signal from the IMO, but I don't have any crystal ball on that one, unfortunately.
Now, if I may just come back on that one, because one pathway going forward could be that the coalition will actually start arguing, in case IMO or the world fleet is to reach the target, then we need X, Y, Z within the midterm measures in order to actually, I mean, that is, a fact, because otherwise the measures coming in 27, we all know how long it takes to put up production facilities, etc., for the e-fuels. So I think that could be a good message to say, well, if this is to actually materialize, then we need X, Y, Z within the regulation.
Yeah, we have, so we published an insight brief on midterm measures in the beginning of the year. Maybe someone can drop the link into the chat, actually, because that's essentially the argument that it makes, or one of three main arguments that it makes. So yes, we very much agree with that as an important part of our overall discussion of it. So yeah, thank you. We're glad to hear that we're on the same page. Mark, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Hi, morning, Jesse. Thanks. Really useful presentation and overview. Great to hear about plans coming forwards. You kind of mentioned the ambition statement around achieving shipping's moonshot ambition for full decarb by 2050. I wondered what kind of pathway you're aiming towards along the way, and any link to science-based targets for maritime sector, or are you more, aligned with current IMO minimum level of ambition or something else?
So the answer to that is that we do not have a pathway specified, in the Getting Zero Coalition's ambition, and that was partly because when that was up for discussion amongst the coalition's strategy group and broader membership, we were simultaneously waiting to see what would happen at MEPC 80, and so now that there are pathways from the IMO, we didn't think it was the right time to immediately present some third pathway. We're quite pleased with the IMO result, as I'm sure most people here are. That doesn't mean that there isn't a need to consider a truly 1.5 aligned pathway or an SBTI aligned pathway in the future. And Femke mentioned the ambition revision in 2026. Part of what we would likely be considering there is whether we need to specify a pathway. So that's basically once the midterm measures are in place and we've identified our own strengths and weaknesses, where companies are in their own ambition setting, etc., that will give us a better base from which to potentially define a pathway for the coalition. But that hasn't been done. It's definitely something we're thinking about, but it's not on the near term.
Okay, thanks. That's clear. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks. Peter, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. And greetings from the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in the middle of the night.
Fantastic.
Yeah, always interesting to drop in on GMF and hear your progress and aspirations. I guess, MEPC 82, we're going to be coming down close to the business edge of what this combination of measures looks like, and I think you're correct that the discussion is going to turn very much towards the framing around revenue disbursement, which is something that hasn't actually been openly discussed in committee at IMO yet. There's been a lot of talk around the edges of it. There's been a whole lot of scenario modelling done within the comprehensive impact assessment process, none of which really take on this issue of what does revenue disbursement mean and how's it going to be happening. Now, I was interested, I heard you comment earlier, commitment to a just and equitable transition, and we're very interested in, as we're preparing the submissions from, I guess, the climate most vulnerable perspective into the next round of negotiations, we're very interested in taking the temperature on what an organisation like GMF thinks that a just and equitable transition actually means. I've dropped 3 questions into the chat there, sort of just to get a really quick gauge, but I guess we're faced with this issue that we think that the agreement reached in 2009 that the majority of revenues would come to the global south and not necessarily directed in sector, or what you guys call in sector, is still what we understand that the global community agreed to in 2009, and certainly what we're pushing for the global community to re-adhere to at this point. But I was interested to hear what Progressive Industry Group thought. Firstly, whether you think that revenue should be diverted out of sector at all. And if you do, what sort, we're looking at the Brazilian proposal of $1 billion or $2, echoed again the Japanese proposal, that's certainly way below anything anyone on my side of the fence is looking at. So I was interested to hear on that. The other question that I had was, and related to that question, is have you guys considered the impact of the ITLOS advisory opinion that just came out last month and its ramifications in terms of how GHG emissions are now defined as pollution? We're taking that as a really big win. We're seeing that immediately collects the dots between pollution and the polluter pays principle, and that's a major determinant on disbursement of revenues. So interested in your reactions on those points. Greetings again.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for joining us. It's fantastic that you're able to join us from this week. I think probably I'll give you a slightly unsatisfying answer in that I don't believe we have positions developed that could specifically answer your question. But before I let Femke speak to where the conversation in the coalition really is now, I just want to say it's important. Thank you very much for joining this meeting and sharing that framing, because I'm not even sure that the specific framing you shared is widely understood, even in a high ambition coalition like this. I think it's fair to say. So it's really useful to have the alternatives spelled out in the way you have in the chat and in the question there. For how far we've come with discussions on that aspect.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Pete, as well for your intervention and your questions. I think firstly, I kind of, as to your question of what is our definition of a just and equitable transition, I just want to underpin that it's not up to us to define what a just and equitable transition actually means. It is up to the countries that are most impacted by climate change and by the transition as well to define what this means. And that's a bit of an unsatisfying answer, of course, also to industry. But we are not the ones that are in the position to define, it requires this and this and this. But it does mean that we are in the position to actually listen to those small island developing states and other low income countries to tell us what it means for them, what a just and equitable transition means, and kind of try and help support their arguments and kind of try and shape, what this means for the wider policy measure debates. And of course, also for the people who are listening from industry side, there's a lot of aspects to a just and equitable transition. And there's a lot of different aspects that need to be taken into account. And of course, some elements are going to be relevant for some countries, others are going to be relevant for other countries. So it's a bit of there's really no answer, and there's really a bit of an unsatisfying answer as well. There's another insight brief that we put out, I think, last year, actually discussing exactly this and what are some elements to keep in mind. And I can post it in the chat later as well. So that's kind of to your question of a definition. We are very much in close contact with a lot of the Pacific states, with the Caribbean states as well, and a lot of our knowledge partners that we work with in the coalition are as well. So that's how we're working with the Getting to Zero coalition with this subject, kind of understanding what their position is and seeing how we can support their asks for a just and equitable transition. So we don't have specific positions on the amount of revenue distribution. It's also hard to say. We're also very much looking to the comprehensive impact assessment and the outcomes, also understanding what the size of the revenues could be. But one main position is that what we have been calling for, and what's also in the insight brief that I have just shared in the chat, is that we really see the need for the policy measures to have both a global fuel standard and a levy, because either alone is not going to be able to provide both the emission reduction certainty, but also not be able to deliver on the just and equitable transition. It really needs to be a combination of both. So that's kind of more the position that we have. Nothing really specific on the actual revenue distribution, but we do support, whatever the countries are saying that they need from a just and equitable transition. And then your third point that I wrote down on the advisory opinion, I haven't seen this. I don't have that much to add, but of course it's a principle that's really key in IMO. And again, links to the just and equitable transition. One element is the need to actually reduce emissions. So that's something that we definitely are looking forward to work with.
Could I come back really quickly?
Please
I
do.
just wanted to check. So, because I mean, we're in the position that we are the people advising the Pacific and the Caribbean in terms of those policy positions right at the moment. So we put out submissions to IWG, the last IWG, setting out very clearly what we thought the revenue disbursement should be, and that a majority of revenue should come to the Global South, and that significant investment should be made outside of the sector under the headings of both mitigation and reparation. What I heard you just say is that you'll follow our lead on that, but I'm not so sure that that's the signal that we're getting back from the members of the organisation. I think there's a lot of people inside industry, whether progressive or not, that would dispute that that is the right way to use revenues for, So I just wanted to check what it is that you were saying there. Because if you're happy to follow our lead, that would be fantastic, but we're not quite convinced that that's actually the situation.
I think what our role here can be is really to make sure that we have this discussion, so that we have an actual discussion with industry and with the Pacific states to help make sure that there's dialogue between the groups, and that industry understands the perspective from the Pacifics and other small island developing states, rather than us necessarily taking that position at the IMO, where we also don't have an observer status, of course. So our role is really around that, as I mentioned before, around the facilitation of dialogue. So we organize, for example, these public-private dialogues with both industry and policymakers, and their just and equitable transition is often very central to the discussion, and we provide a stage, let's say, to the Pacific Islands to also share their perspective, and for industry to have that discussion around what is needed. So I think that's really where our main role is within this discussion.
Well, once again, thank you, Pete. It's very important to hear these questions framed in the specific way that you shared. That's part of what Pamela described, right? So having that brought up in this meeting when we have a pretty broad representation from the coalition is quite useful. So thank you for joining us in the middle of the night. And do we have any other reflections from participants? I am not seeing any hands, and I'm not inclined to cold call on anyone and force anyone to intervene. As we keep the microphone or keep the floor open for a minute, I will add something that hasn't been said yet. I referred just now to the fact that we haven't done this before, and we're not exactly sure where we might need to do some course correction along the way. We have this excellent reference group that is helping us develop the form right now and refine the categories. But it might be valuable to have other companies who are interested in having an early look volunteer to do so, and flag any reflections they might have about the form itself. That would be something that we'd be interested in. We don't think that we should have 50 or 60 pilot companies, but we would be happy to share with a handful if you were interested in looking at it before it's finalized and providing your reflection beyond the work of the reference group. We're happy to do that. So you can get in touch with myself or Pemka afterwards if you're interested in doing that. In terms of next steps, I think we've already shared the timeline. So you can, those of you who don't request early access, will be hearing from us at the beginning of September. And we do really think that this should be as painless a process as possible, and we'll be here to support you throughout it. Anything else we want to convey, Pemka, before we perhaps wrap up a little early?
I don't think so. In just in general, if you have also just general questions or doubts or suggestions, just feel free to reach out via email.
Yes, always welcome. And we thank you for sitting through a somewhat atypical Getting Zero meeting today. And for those of you who shared your thoughts, really appreciate that as well. So we look forward to seeing you at our next discussion, maybe slightly more interactive, and seeing you out in the decarbonization universe. Thanks, as always, for your support for the coalition.